before that fleeting instant, Augustine and his mother were talking about the world to come and what would heaven be like, and were agreeing that it could, whatever it was like, however wonderful the physical pleasures we have in this world, that they were going to be nothing compared to what would happen in the next. So they were discussing this topic. When their moment of consummation with God was over, one of the reasons that they knew it was over was because, as he says, we returned with a sigh, we returned to the sound of our own speech, in which each word has a beginning and an ending. And so, in other words, what he's saying here is that human speech belongs in a different realm to the mystical realm. That in that context, that human speech has nothing to say, can't function. His account of his mystical experience was that he reached out and touched it. So it was not a question of articulation or communication, but a simpler physical sensation. And this account of Augustine and Monica's experience is very similar to many of the other mystical fathers and mothers who had similar experiences. But the one difference is that Augustine and Monica were together when this happened, because we usually associate the mystical moment with people who are by themselves. This is a one-to-one encounter with God, and not in the company of anybody else. And this is, to some extent, interesting, because one of the important aspects of moving to a place of prayer that might lead to a mystical transcendence is for solitude, but built upon this idea of communality. So very many of the mystics whom we know of were actually living in communion, but having that experience separately. There are two ways in which mystics are seen to access this kind of event. The first is what's called the positive way, or the via positiva, in which the subject focuses and thinks of all God's blessings, all the beauty He's given us in this world, perhaps on some event in the life of Jesus, and focus in this way to reach a position of contemplative prayer, which then may lead them open to that moment of transcendence which they're seeking. We see this kind of approach in the writings of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote the Song of Songs, and who described in this way how he had achieved his own encounter with his God. The other way is different. The other way is called the via negativa, and it's based on the idea that in fact we don't know far more about God than we do know, and so for that reason we can't expect through our own thoughts or ideas as to what God is made of, we can't expect to reach a place of contemplation that will give us access to Him. And so this approach, which is seen more in thinkers like St. John of the Cross, this approach is different and consists of an attempt to move away from any kind of subjective imaginings or feelings, to empty the heart and the soul, to approach a place of emptiness and abandonment in the knowledge that God is so different and is so very far from us that the only way we may possibly gain access to him is if we follow a pathway that will take us away from ourselves. We won't look into ourselves, but will take us away from ourselves. Thomas Merton called this approach the way of nada, the way of nothingness, where we empty all subjective feelings and emotions to reach that place of objectivity, which may allow us access to a mystical experience. We are going to talk now about the two poets. We'll have the next slide, please. This is T.S. Eliot, an American poet born in 1888. And the other poet that we're going to talk about is Robert Lowe. These are interesting men. They were both American. They were both from the same part of New England. And they both, in fact, they were distant cousins. And they were from families who had come together across in the Mayflower. So in that way, they were probably as near to aristocratic Americans as we could imagine. They came from privileged backgrounds and with a strong heritage of academic success. Each of them had relatives who were president of Harvard College. Both of them had religious conversions in their 20s, and both were very interested in mysticism and in the mystics. T.S. Eliot was born in Mississippi. His family had moved there 2 generations before for business purposes, but the poet had retained a sense of his New England legacy, and he spent his childhood summers in Massachusetts. He was raised as a Unitarian, which is a loose group of associated churches who have in common that they don't believe in the divinity of Christ nor of the Holy Spirit. He studied comparative literature at Harvard, and he also studied Indian philosophy and Sanskrit, which gave him an entree into the area of Eastern mysticism. And he then went to the Sorbonne, where he worked with Henri Bergson, the philosopher, who also was interested in mysticism. He became an agnostic at about 20, and he then, after the First World War, moved to London, where he spent the rest of his life. Before he left America, on a day in the unlikely scenario of Cambridge Yard and Harvard Square, he had an experience about which he wrote a poem in 1910. Silence. And this was a poem about a sudden and unexpected moment of transcendence that he had in the middle of a busy day in Harvard College, in the square. And this is the poem. Along the city streets it's still high tide, yet the garrulous waves of life shrink and divide with 1,000 incidents vexed and debated. This is the hour for which we waited. So the first stanza describes the busy city with its garrulous waves of life and the vexed and debated 1,000 incidents. It's a busy scene. And then he moves on. This is the hour for which we waited. And the hour for which we waited is described in the second stanza. This is the ultimate hour when life is justified. The seeds of experience that were so broad and deep, so immediate and steep, are suddenly still. You may say what you will. At such peace I am terrified. There is nothing else beside. So he moves in the first stanza from that busy city scene to the second stanza, where suddenly all the noise stops. Everything is suddenly still. You may say what you will. At such peace I am terrified. So this is not a reassuring experience. The speaker here is frightened by what he's going through. And still, he closes his account by saying, there is nothing else beside. This is the ultimate moment. So we can see that there are echoes here of what Augustine tells us in his confession about the event at Ostia. That there was talk, and then the talk stopped unexpectedly and suddenly, and then there was a feeling that hadn't been experienced before. Now, Eliot was an agnostic when this happened, and there is no Christian subtext to this poem. But he did write about it in later years, and made the point that this was an experience that never left him. Even though it happened when he was quite young, it never left him. So after World War I, he had been continuing his philosophical studies in Harvard, and he had actually completed a PhD except to do his viva. But he left without doing the viva and went to London, much against the will of his family. He went to London to become a poet. And in 1922, he published a poem called The Wasteland. Good. He published a poem called The Wasteland, which in a very important year, the same year that James Joyce published Ulysses, and Virginia Woolf published The Lighthouse. It was a big year for modernist writers, and this was a poem that made a big impact from the time that it was published. The poem expresses that post-war desolation felt all over the Western world after the First World War, which was such a barbaric and cataclysmic event after the 19th century, when the hope was of enlightenment, that humanity was advancing, and all sorts of technical and scientific discoveries were being made that were improving the kind of lives that people in some parts of the world were leading. And then the First World War came, and suddenly it seemed that actually we were not advancing at all, but regressing into the kind of barbarity that hadn't been seen since the Middle Ages. And so, in the poem, Eliot describes a landscape of barren places without hope. Mostly he's describing England, because he was living in England at the time. But he's really describing the kind of lives that people were living in this scenario. And it also, of course, reflected, his own personal life, which at the time was very difficult, and he was in a kind of despair. So this is one section out of The Wasteland, which is a long poem. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sounds of water. Here is no water, but only rock. Rock and no water and a sandy road. Notice that one. Can we go back? Well, I'll read it from here, it's okay. Rock and no water. Yes, here we are. If there were rock and also water, and water. Now for Eliot, who was raised in Mississippi and who spent his summers in Gloucester, Massachusetts by the sea, water, even before he became a Christian, had a redemptive quality. And so the lack of water in the wasteland is a reflection of how hopeless and barren a landscape that he saw the world at that time. A spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, not the cicada and dry grass singing, but the sound of water over a rock, where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip drop, drip drop, 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 drop. But there is no water. And so, here in this passage, we can see how he tries every which way to imagine some water, if there were only water, if there were only even the sound of water, but he can't find it. And so he has to conclude by facing the fact that there is no water. Now, in 1927, Eliot converted and became a Christian. He joined the Anglican Church, and he remained a member of the Anglican Church for the rest of his days. 3 years after he joined the Anglican Church, he published a poem called Ash Wednesday, which is generally recognised as his conversion poem, and marked a turn to more overtly religious themes, and explores the idea of repentance and the quest for a real relationship with God. Ash Wednesday is another quite a long poem. There are 7 sections in it, and I'm going to read from a passage which is in section 4, which is sometimes called the garden section, where he attempts to imagine what it would be like to reach that kind of relationship with God that he is trying to find. Who walked between the violet and the violet, who walked between the various ranks of varied green, going in white and blue in Mary's colour, talking of trivial things, in ignorance and knowledge of eternal dolour, who moved among the others as they walked, who then made strong the fountains and made fresh the springs. But the fountain sprang up and the birds sprang down, redeeming the time, redeeming the dream, the token of the word unheard, unspoken, till the wind shakes 1,000 whispers from the yew. And after this they are exiled. Now in the first, in fact, for most of this poem, in the first passage, the walk through the violet and the various ranks of varied green, going in white and blue in Mary's colour, is very optimistic, and it does seem as if this poem is moving in the direction of redemption. He even raises after the fountains became strong, and remember, Eliot in the wasteland could find no water. Here there is water. The fountains have been made strong, and the springs made fresh. And the fountains sprang up, and the birds sang down. Redeem the time, redeem the dream. But then, towards the end of section 4, the last 3 lines, the token of the word unheard, unspoken. The word unheard, unspoken isn't there. Unspoken, it can't be heard. And the wind, the only thing that can be heard is the wind shaking 1,000 whispers from the yew, which is usually found in the graveyard. And more tellingly, the last line, after this our exile, comes, as we probably all know, from the Salve Regina. But the line isn't finished. He cannot seem to articulate, after this our exile, show unto us the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. And so he actually leaves the sentence hanging there with no punctuation. He finishes with the word exile, so that the line perhaps might even suggest, after this our exile, is our exile coming next? There's no redemptive promise in the way he leaves the end of this section. And he finishes the rest of the poem by resuming its litany of repentance, and its final line, the final line of the whole poem, beseeches, and let my cry come unto thee. Then, late in his career, in 1944, almost at the end of the Second World War, Eliot published his last great poem, The Four Quartets, which is a poem in 4 sections. A poem in 4 sections. It's about 30 pages long. It's a book poem. and each section is in a different setting, all of which were important to him in his own development. 3 of them in England and 1 of them in America. So I'm going to read here from the first section. The 4 Quartets is a poem that he spent 4 or 5 years working on, and he based it structurally on the idea of musical structure. So there are themes, like harmonies, and I'm not musical, but you know what I mean, where some composers will have a series of notes that recur through the piece. And the 4 Quartets is made like that, where there are ideas that come and go in a flow. It's a very beautiful poem. And thematically, it looks very much at the nature of time, because by now, Eliot was an older man, he was almost 60. And it also looks at man's relationship with the world and with God. And it pays particular attention to the idea of mystical experience. So the first passage I'm going to read is from the second section. You say I am repeating something I've said before. I shall say it again. Shall I say it again? In order to arrive there, to arrive where you are, to get from where you are not, you must go by a way wherein there is no ecstasy. In order to arrive at what you do not know, you must go by a way which is the way of ignorance. In order to possess what you do not possess, you must go by the way of dispossession. And what you do not know is the only thing you know. And what you own is what you do not own. And where you are is where you are not. Now, those of you who were here when Stephen Reynolds gave his discussion on John at the Cross 5 or 6 weeks ago will recognise this piece, because this is from St. John at the Cross. So this is commentary, I suppose. It's based on John of the Cross's commentary on the Via Negativa, which is very interesting because, there were some critics who felt that Eliot's poem about the wasteland was actually a poem about the Via Negativa, but about a Via Negativa that had no redemptive element at its conclusion. And so he still ponders on the Via Negativa in the 4 Quartets, but in a slightly different way. And now I'm going to read the last 15 or 20 lines of 4 Quartets, starting with: We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. Through the unknown remembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall and the children in the apple tree, not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard in the stillness between 2 waves of the sea. Quick now, here, now, always. A condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. So this long passage, starting at "We shall not cease from exploration," you notice that in it, in fact, in this whole section of 4 Quartets, almost in the whole poem of 4 Quartets, there is hardly any punctuation, which means that the lines flow in a way that seems to follow the pattern of perhaps the ideal contemplative prayer. It moves from one to the next without interjection, without stress, without tension. And so when he promises we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Here he's moving through his thoughts without anxiety, without tension, and he's allowing himself to move on to where he needs to go next. Through the unknown remembered gate, at the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children not known because not looked for, but half heard in the stillness between two waves of the sea. And then there's this line, quick, now, here, always. A change, these are short words. There is a change here in the speech pattern and the thought pattern. And the poem is bringing us to a condition of complete simplicity. A condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. Costing not less than everything. So this is a condition which is very simple, but which is priceless. It costs everything. And it's the condition that brings us to consider, in the words of Julian of Norwich, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And when shall they be well? When the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. And here the poem moves from the quotation from Julian of Norwich to a different kind of mystical imagery, where we are back again to John of the Cross and the living flame. John of the Cross, who was quoted about 15 pages earlier in the poem. And this is the end of Eliot's poem. So what he does in the four quartets is that he brings us in a kind of symphonic movement through various high roads and by roads of thought, and reference to other figures from whom he has learnt himself. He also addresses the poet Dante in this poem. It's a lovely poem, and anybody who would think of reading it shouldn't be daunted by the fact that it's 30 pages long, because sometimes it's just fine to read 4 lines. You don't have to read 30 pages. Sometimes in 4 lines you'll find what you need today. We don't have to see it, as a whole poem. So Eliot published the 4 quartets in 1944, and the other poet who we're going to look at, Robert Lowell, published his first book of poetry in the same year. I've mentioned already that these poets were related. Lowell was a lot younger. He was born in 1917. He and Eliot were not alone distantly related, but they were acquaintances through the medium of poetry. Eliot worked as a poetry editor in Faber and Faber in London, and he actually edited several of Lowell's, the English edition of several of Lowell's books. Lowell was raised in Boston. He was an only child, and he studied at Harvard and Kenyon College. He had a degree in classics. 2 very significant events happened in his 20s. He converted to Catholicism in 1941. He had been raised in the Episcopalian tradition, but not in it was probably more nominal than active membership of the Episcopalian Church. And he moved to Catholicism in 1941 after much theological reading and instruction. At the time before his conversion, he was very interested in figures like Cardinal Newman, Jacques Maritain, and Etienne Gilson, whose writing about Bernard of Clairvaux influenced him very much. He was a fervently observant convert. He in the early 40s, during the World War, he was a conscientious objector to the First World War, and during the World War II, he was living initially in Alabama, which is not a very Catholic state, and he used to travel by 2 buses fasting to get Mass and Communion. Then he moved to New York to work in the offices of Sheed and Ward, the Catholic publishers, and interesting, after last week, it's interesting to report that he, at the time, decided that his wife, who was also a Catholic convert, but in a very different kind of manner, that his wife should go to help Dorothy Day in one of her soup kitchens in the Bowery. It wasn't a very successful arrangement. His wife was a very different kind of woman. Only lasted a couple of days in the Bowery before she left. He published 3 books of poetry in the 1940s, which are generally regarded as his Catholic and his religious books. And the first of these that we're going to look at now is called Cistercians in Germany. This was in a book, published in a book called The Land of Unlikeness, which title has its origin from Bernard, and maybe St. Augustine also, but I'm not sure. Bernard. Here corpse and soul go bare, the leader's headpiece capers to his imagination's tumblings. Now this poem, I should have sort of explained, this poem, the setting of this poem is a Cistercian monastery in Germany, and places these monks in the tradition, a tradition in which Lowell was very interested, but also in a context where all sorts of other, very difficult things were going on. And so this first stanza that we're looking at here, in it he imagines the setting of Nazi Germany, where this monastery is situated. The party barks at its unsteady fledglings to goose step in red tape and microphones, sow the 4 winds with babble. Here the dragon sucklings tumble on steel scales and puff billows of cannon fodder from the beaks of beehive camps, munition pools and scrap heaps, and here the serpent digs up Jesus' blood. Yesterday pagan Junkers smashed ourselves. Junkers were planes that were flying the American Air Force, and so this was an airstrike that unfortunately landed in the monastery. And in this unlikely setting, suddenly the tone of the poem changes. We lift, and the monks are speaking, we lift our bloody hands to wizened Bernard, to Bernard gathering his canticle of flowers, his soul a bridal chamber fresh with flowers, and all his body one ecstatic womb, as through the trellis peers the sudden bridegroom. So here Lowell, just in fact as Eliot had done earlier, is borrowing words from another mystical figure, from Bernard of Clairvaux. This is resonates very much with passages from the Song of Songs, which describe the soul waiting for the arrival of the bridegroom. And the bridegroom in the Song of Songs looks through, well, in any translation I've seen, it calls it a lattice, which is almost the same thing as the trellis. And we can see that actually the progression here that leads to this mystical experience in the monastery cell is very different, in that it's a very dramatic and noisy background, the party barking and goose stepping and billows of cannon fodder. So there's something unconvincing about Lowell's transition here from the first half of the poem to the last couple of lines. It doesn't ring exactly true. He wrote another poem during the Second World War, when, as a conscientious objector, he'd been in jail for a year, and then he was released to a town in southern Massachusetts called Black Rock, where he was working washing dishes in an institution in this town. And he wrote a poem called Colloquy in Black Rock. The reason he mentioned St. Stephen, because the local church was called St. Stephen's, where he used to attend Mass. In black mud, he writes, Stephen the martyr was broken down to blood. Our ransom is the rubble of his death. Christ walks on the black water. In black mud darts the kingfisher. On Corpus Christi heart, over the drumbeat of St. Stephen's choir, I hear him, stupor mundi, and the mud flies from his hunching wings and beak. My heart, the blue kingfisher, dives on you in fire. So here again is a sudden dramatic moment where the blue kingfisher, the fisher king, sometimes used as a symbol of transcendence, dives on the heart of the speaker in a movement that's almost annihilatory, suggesting that something very important is happening here. But just as with Cistercians in Germany, there is such a busy background here that it's very difficult for us to imagine in the way that St. Augustine described that this is really a feasible occurrence. He wrote another poem in his next book, Lord Weary's Castle. And Lord Weary's Castle was the book published in 1946 that made Lowell's name. He won the Pulitzer Prize. It was a very religious book. There were lots of poems using Catholic imagery. And this poem that we're going to read now, where the rainbow ends, is the concluding poem of the book. So in that way, it's making a particular important concluding statement. The background to this poem is that Lowell was very interested in a British theologian, lay theologian called E.I. Watkin, who wrote several books on mysticism. And he wrote a book called The Bow in the Clouds, in which he used the rainbow as a symbol of mystical transcendence, because he was using the properties of the rainbow, its unpredictable occurrence, its short duration, and its fleeting ephemeral beauty as a way to symbolize what happened during the mystical impulse. He wasn't a mystic himself, but he was very interested in the theory of mysticism. The setting of the poem is in Boston, and it's relevant here that Boston, in the view of the Puritans, and Lowell was descended from the Puritans, from the original, some of the original Mayflower Pilgrims. In the view of the Puritans, Boston was a place of sin, a place where Satan was, and so there is this tension in the poem between its setting, which is not a holy place, and what the poem is trying to achieve, trying to articulate in this place where no good can be expected. The pepper pot, ironic rainbow, spans the Charles River and its scales of scorched earth miles. I saw my city in the scales, the pans of judgment rising and descending. Piles of dead leaves char the air, and I am a red arrow on this graph of revelations. Every dove is sold. The chapel's sharp-shinned eagle shifts its hold on serpentine, the rainbow's epitaph. So this first half of the poem describes the city of Boston, and there's a kind of an apocalyptic air to it. There are dragons and serpents, and the speaker is a red arrow in the graph of revelations. The second verse starts in more or less the same tone. In Boston, serpents whistle at the cold. The victim climbs the altar steps and sings, Hosanna to the lion, lamb and beast, who fans the furnace face of Is with wings. I breathe the ether of my marriage feast. At the high altar, gold and a fair cloth, I kneel and the wings beat my cheek. What can the dove of Jesus give you now but wisdom, exile? Stand and live, the dove has brought an olive branch to eat. So yet again, suddenly at the end of the poem, the emphasis moves and the perspective of the poem moves from some place that doesn't promise any kind of redemption to some place where redemption suddenly happens. And there are ambiguities that undermine this conclusion. In the first stanza, we have heard that every dove is sold, and yet the last line of the second stanza, in its resolution, promises that the dove has brought an olive branch to eat. Just after Lord Weary's Castle was published, in 1947, Lowell had a crisis because this was the second big event of his years just before he was 30. He had a psychiatric crisis while he was attending retreat at a Trappist monastery in Rhode Island, where he had been several times before. And he had an acute psychiatric crisis with hallucinations, which initially he thought perhaps might be the mystical fulfillment towards which he had always been working. But in fact it wasn't. It was a serious illness. He was in hospital for months. It took him a long time to recover. Partly, probably not completely, but partly because of this event, he moved away from the Catholic Church and never ever practiced as a Catholic again. And from about 1950 then, his poetry took a different turn altogether. He began to write very personal poetry about his own background, about his familiar association with American history, and he also became quite a political poet. In the late 50s and early 60s, America saw a lot of political unrest, with student protests and civil rights movement, and Lowell was an important voice in some of these areas. But there was another strand in his poetic output of those years which is interesting, and we're going to talk about this next, which is the public garden. The public garden. This is a poem about the Boston Public Garden, which is a municipal garden, as you'd find in any city. The park is drying. The dead leaves thicken to a ball inside the basin of a fountain, where the heads of 4 stone lions stare and suck on empty fossils. So we are back again now to a place where there is no water. This is a bleak landscape. It's not a very attractive public park. The lions stare and suck on empty faucet is an American tap. The taps are more dry even. And then the second half of the poem is more nostalgic. Remember summer. Bubbles filled the fountain and we splashed. We drowned in Eden while Jehovah's grass-green lyre was rustling all about us in the leaves that gurgled by us, turning upside down. The fountain's failing waters flash around the garden. Nothing catches fire. So here he describes a kind of paradise lost. He's in the arid park without attractions, and he remembers in the summer when there was water and when the fountain was splashing and where the environment was like Eden. And then in the last 2 lines of the poem, he's back to the reality of the present again. The fountain's failing waters flash around the garden, but nothing catches fire. In 1967, he wrote a poem called Waking Early Sunday Morning, which is to do really with the idea that Sundays are different now in the post-Christian world in which he lives, in which a lot of people live. It resonates with another poet, Wallace Stevens, who wrote a similar poem about how Sunday now is a secular day. It's a long poem, Waking Early Sunday Morning, and so we're only having 2 extracts. In the first, he describes, he hears the church bells in the stanza before this one. In the stanza before this one, he describes hearing church bells from the next village. O Bible, chopped and crucified, in hymns we hear but do not read. They sing of peace and preach despair. Yet they gave the darkness some control and left a loophole for the soul. No, put old clothes on and explore the corners of the woodshed for its dregs and dreck. Tools with no handle, 10 candle lens not worth a candle, old lumber banished from the temple, damned by Paul's precept and example, cast from the kingdom, banned in Israel, the wordless sign, the tinkling cymbal. So here in this stanza, he regrets the loss of the security that used to be available from those hymns that now we hear but do not read, because they gave the darkness some control, they gave some security, they gave a foothold in an uncertain life. And then he moves on this Sunday morning to put some old clothes on, just as now perhaps somebody might wash their car. He goes to explore the corners of the woodshed, and in it he finds relics of what he's just been talking about. Old lumber banished from the temple, cast from the kingdom, banned in Israel, the wordless sign, the tinkling cymbal. And then he moves to a position of almost faith. When will we see him face to face? Each day he shines through darker glass. These are a version of the words of St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. In this small town where everything is known, I see his vanishing emblems, his white spire and flagpole sticking out above the fog. Lowell used this image a lot. New England is full of lovely white painted wooden churches with narrow spires pointing up into the sky, and he often alludes to them as a pointless aspiration. They are a relic of something that is no longer felt towards the heavens, but in the eyes of the viewers, the heavens aren't there anymore. His white spire and flagpole sticking out above the fog, and like old white china doorknobs, sad, slight, useless things to calm the mad. And Lowell knew what it was like to have your madness calmed. His psychiatric illness revisited him almost every year of his life. He spent several months of every year either suffering or suffering in the throes of his manic attack, or trying to pull himself together afterwards and get back to work again. Now we're going to look at a sonnet that he wrote 3 years after Waking Early Sunday Morning in 1970. It's called God of Our Fathers. And like a lot of sonnets, it offers one perspective in the first, say, 2/3, the first 8 lines usually in the sonnet, and then moves to on the other hand in the last 5 or 6 lines. Say it's the one-way trip, the one-way flight, then you could say you stood in the cold light of science, seeing as you were seen, espoused to fact. Strange, a life is the fire and fuel. We are the animals, the object. We must be here without a title deed of evidence that anything that stopped living ever falls back to living when life stops. So in other words, here Lowell is offering a scientific view that this mortal life is the life that he's actually saying here. There is not a title deed of evidence that anything that stopped living ever lives again when life stops. And then he points out, there's more romance to the watchmaker god of Descartes and Paley. He drafted and installed the apparatus for us. He loved to tinker, who, having perfected what he had to do, stood off, shrouded in his loneliness. So here he's talking about an image of God, which earlier philosophers had alluded to, that that God created the world as you might create and wind up a clock, and that having wound it, he then stood back and let it tick away by itself. Except that the poem sees this creating figure standing off, shrouded in his loneliness, apart. God of Our Fathers comes from a collection of sonnets. No, it was a whole book full of sonnets. And now I'm going to just go very quickly through 3 other extracts from the same book, from different sonnets, where he expresses other facets of this idea. One is called Quality 1. One can be washed white in the foam of the divine. This once, only once? No, almost at will when one is young. This ends since God is quality, one eye could never do without or with, ears that heard not, mouth that said not, eyes. And like in Eliot's line from Salve Regina, this line just peters away. The poem cannot articulate any resolution to this. It doesn't know what to say next. In the next sonnet, Revenants, and Revenants are kind of ghosts, those who return. And this poem is actually about old cousins of his whom he remembered when he was young. And they come back to him in a dream and they speak to him. And they say to him, dead, we have come to realize what others must have known from infancy. God is not about. We are less scared. With misty bounds, we scale the starry sheer. So his ghostly cousins seem to have come to this realization that God is not about. They seem to recover from it, scaling the starry sheer. And then in words, the last sonnet we're going to talk about, he says, in our time, God is an entirely lost person. So here we see that for the last 20 years of his career, unlike Eliot, who moved closer and closer to a place of resolution in his poetic expression of his own Christian endeavour, Lowell had left any attempt to try to work within the Christian family aside. And still, for the rest of his working life, he was always prodded by this idea that God is absent. He was always asking, when shall we see him face to face? Where is he now? Now this idea of an absent God is not a new one. Martin Luther wrote about and spoke about the Deus absconditus, the absent God. And his sense of God's absence was because God's people were too unworthy for God to come any closer to. And in the 19th century, there was this sense with advancing scientific knowledge and Darwinian thought that actually God's story wasn't relevant anymore. Matthew Arnold, the poet, wrote about that in Dover Beach, where he compared the ebbing tide on the beach with the melancholy long withdrawing roar of the receding God in a post-Christian world. And there's another figure that I think is very interesting in terms of Lowell. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, at the end of his career, began to look at the idea also of the absent God. After World War II, and Martin Heidegger had a very kind of controversial World War II because he had a relationship with Nazi Germany that almost landed him in jail, but which resulted in he was discredited really as a philosophical teacher, and with some difficulty he finally got back to work in university again. But at this time he began to he had a change of emphasis in his career, and one of the things he began to write about was God's absence. And I'm just going to quote a little bit from a book called Poetry, Language and Thought. Now this is a little bit confusing because the translators of this edition sometimes translate Heidegger's use of Abfehl, which is the German word that is often translated as absence, and the translators sometimes they hold that Heidegger's idea of absence is not just absence, as you might be absent from school, say, but that Heidegger's idea of the absence of God is looking at a kind of absence which also incorporates the idea of what they call missingness. In other words, it's an absence that is regretted. It is a focus on somebody who is not there, but who should be there and who is wished for. And so that's why this sentence starts with the missingness. The missingness of God, says Heidegger, forebodes something even grimmer, however, for the divine radiance has become extinguished in the world's history. The time of the world's night is a destitute time because it becomes ever more destitute. It has already grown so destitute that it can no longer discern the absence of God as an absence. And later, in another book, he wrote, absence is not nothing. And then he says something quite interesting. Heidegger is notoriously complicated, and I'm sure perhaps for that reason some stuff is lost in translation. But he says this: it is actually the appropriating presence of the hidden plenitude of what is past, and hence it is the collected presence of the divine things of ancient Greece, of prophetic Israel, of the sermon of Jesus. This no more is in itself, and not yet, of the veiled coming of his inexhaustible presence. Now, I don't ever claim or imagine that I can follow clearly Heidegger's thought, because it is very complex. But what I think he's saying there is that the no more, in other words, the absence, because it is here no more, the no more is in itself and not yet. In other words, that in the concept of absence, and especially the kind of absence where something is missed, in the concept of that absence, there is always an underpinning that there may be and not yet, that perhaps absence holds, because absence has no presence, that perhaps this is why absence matters, because it offers the concept of a presence that used to be, or that seemed to be. And sometimes I think, with regard to Lowell's recurring examination of this theme, that his view of God's absence follows almost a similar pattern, though he doesn't really ever express this kind of optimism of the not yet. Lowell never talks about the not yet, but he does say what is absent is something of value that I regret. How's our time, Stephen? Is it? Okay. Well, if our time is okay, there's one more thing I want to share with you, which is a poem that I read in The Observer about 2 or 3 weeks ago. The Observer once a month do a best recent poetry publication article, which is very interesting. And this is a poem. This is a poem by a poet called Philip Gross, and his book is The 13th Angel, which is just published. And interestingly, in view of what we've been talking about tonight, it is on the shortlist for the T.S. Eliot Memorial Prize, which is to be judged, I think, next month. And I thought we might read it and see. Maybe we might talk through it before we read it. So the first thing that we should always do when we look at a poem, because sometimes poems are hard to follow, is we should look at the title. And this is actually a very clear title, because it says something we can understand. Psalm. We know what a psalm is. It's unusual because there are two words in the title. Psalm, you. And there is a colon, a piece of punctuation after the word psalm, which usually suggests a kind of presentation. So the psalm is presenting what follows. And what follows seems to be the word you. So, you, who can number the waves on the sea, and each wave say where it began. So perhaps you, because not only does it rhyme with you, with who, but it obviously is connected to it. You who. Perhaps you, then, is the subject of this poem. You who can number the waves on the sea, and each wave say where it began, and you who number likewise the best of each heart, my mud pulse in my cupped hand, and the tremor tick in the breast of the greenfinch, found stunned by the stroke of wrong sky that was our window. And you will go back again to number likewise. You who can number likewise the quickening to number that of the pulse on the scan, the clump of cells still undecided to be bird or fish or mammal, to number their count until the end. Would we wish to know that of ourselves or the ones by our side? You who tolerate our counting rhymes, child to child in the dark. So, who do you think is you? Who is the poem talking to? The poem is talking to God. This is the same you that the Psalms talk to, because this is a psalm. So the poem is talking to God, who numbers all the hairs in your head, exactly, and numbers all these things in this beautiful world that God has made, and who tolerates our counting rhymes, child to child, in the dark, our counting rhymes. Our counting rhymes are like psalms, which are numbered, and which we chant ourselves, like children in the darkness of our ignorance. And the poem is telling God, is acknowledging to God that we are aware that God tolerates this. And who tolerates also our itch to call a wave, discrete, that's separate, as if we believed in a moment where a thing becomes a thing, distinct from the whole ocean. Seamlessness. So we, in our human foolishness, see the wave, but we don't see that it's not just a wave, it's actually only a particle of the sea. We forget the seamlessness that joins the whole ocean together. And this is the seamlessness which you, if we can use the word at all, if we can humbly address you, which you must surely see or be, the seamlessness which you must surely see, so God must surely see the seamlessness, or be the seamlessness. Thank you for listening.